let me just get set up here. Hopefully, should be in good shape. All right, I think we're good to go. Well, I mean, to be honest, my slides are just another 45 minutes of questions to set. I was sitting there kind of enjoying that. I did take your advice as well, and I've used Keynote rather than building my own thing. One of the keys for that is that I've got a nice timer here. I was putting in 45 minutes, and I accidentally put it in as 45 hours. But I recognised my mistake before I started, so I changed it. I know I'm the only thing that stands between you all and some lunch, so we'll try and go through reasonably quickly. So I changed the name of this talk a little bit as well. It was in the program as static site strategies, and I changed it to dynamic static site strategies. It's a hell of a mouthful. I added this word dynamic because I think it describes a little bit about what I'm trying to talk about, a little bit more detail. But it is kind of odd to have the word dynamic and static both in the same sentence like that. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but hopefully I'll try and explain as we go along what that's about. I am going to be talking about static site generators and static site generation. So it's maybe a bit of a different slant from some of the things that we've talked about before. I wasn't happy with that title, as you may have guessed, and I was trying to make it a little bit playful. So I was thinking about SSG Whiz at one point, but I'll be honest, SSG Whiz sounds like just the worst name for a battleship you could think of, so I veered away from that. So we're back stuck with dynamic static site strategies, which I'll try never to say again because it's just too much of a tongue twister. Before we get into this, a little bit of an introduction, just so that you know who I am and you know who's standing talking to you. My name's Phil. I'm Phil Hawksworth. I work, as mentioned, I work at an agency in RGA. I actually work in the London office. We're headquartered in New York, and we've got an office right here in Bucharest as well. So a lot of development happens right here, and no one likes someone who's going to come and haul their company around, but we're always looking for more good developers, so we'll leave that there. We're probably not going to have time for many questions. I'll stand here and take as many questions as you like, but I'm conscious that you probably want to eat some food as well. So you can tweet any questions or comments at me. My Twitter handle is very easy, it's just my name. You know, if you've got anything that you agree with or you think I'm talking nonsense, put it on there or grab me afterwards. Just come and let me know. And of course, we've got the hashtag for the event as well. Okay, so in the work that I do, at RGA, we work a lot with all kinds of different clients. You know, Merchant mentioned there's people like Nike, Google, Getty, Beats by Dre, those kind of people. But my background is in front-end development, and you know, I care a lot about web development, which is one of the reasons I'm here, of course. And I think that front-end development has come a long way. You know, I used to have conversations with people. You know, I'd talk to someone in a bar, and they'd say, "What do you do?" Or say, "Oh, I'm a software engineer." "Oh, what language?" Because I don't know about here, but certainly in London, you can't move for people who write software for a living. So they'd say, "Oh, what language?" I'd say JavaScript, and then they kind of have this response. Well, it used to really frustrate me, and I think we've all probably encountered that as people who've been writing JavaScript for a length of time. But you know, the world is changing. The last few years, I think we've seen that the kind of tools and the kind of engineering practices that we've got have really been evolving quite a lot, particularly in web development and in front-end engineering. You know, the kind of things that we've been hearing about just today already really kind of shine a light on that. There's a little bit of a risk involved in that, of course. You know, I kind of think about how much you need to learn and how much you need to learn again and again and again. It's always moving very quickly. And you know, I kind of talk about the hipster tax, you know, the kind of effort you've got to keep in to try and stay on top of the new kind of shiny toy. And I kind of think a little bit about the good old days, you know, the days when I started writing software for the web, just with simple web pages. And you know, when I was studying, I did a computer science degree a long time ago, and developing for the web wasn't part of the syllabus at all. You know, it wasn't really a thing that people cared about at the time. I'm aging myself a little bit. But one of the things I loved was I found that I had this magical directory, this htdocs directory in my hard drive. No one ever told me what that was, but it turned out to be the hypertext documents directory. And it was like magic that anything that I put in there would be served up on this URL on the university's website. Before people reach for their phones, this is long gone, so you won't ever see my favourite basketball player and my hit counter that said 8. That's all been long gone. But the thing that kind of I was excited about is this lovely way that we could write things that would appear on the web, this lovely simple kind of feedback loop we had. You know, we'd write text and you know, we'd save it in our text editor, and then we'd refresh the browser, and then, you know, joyfully what we had there, it was instantly conveyed onto the page, and then we'd kind of repeat, and it was just this lovely experience. So it's very, very immediate. So we kind of started simple, but then of course we became a little bit more ambitious. We wanted to do something that was more than just putting something static on the page. And I didn't really know how to go about doing this. So I spoke to a friend of mine, another guy who was studying a couple of years ahead of me at university. How do I make this site a little bit more dynamic? How do I make it so that I can interact with it and gather data a little bit more? At the time, I imagine I just probably wanted a guest book. And he came back and he said, oh, what you need is a CG bin. I had no idea what a CG bin could possibly be, so I was thinking of trebuchets and dustbin. I didn't know what he was talking about, but of course he meant the CGI bin, where you could put all your Perl scripts, and then you get into the world of plumbing and infrastructure. You could start hitting databases, do something a little bit more interesting, a little bit more dynamic with that. And so between now and that time then, I think all of the sites that I've been involved in have actually grown in complexity. There's been more plumbing, there's been more infrastructure, there's been more that's kind of got in the way of that lovely simple feedback loop that I used to have. It got a lot more complex. And so with this talk about static sites, I'm kind of taking a glance towards a return to simplicity, certainly in terms of what's hosting and serving the site, because we all know how much complexity has come to the front end now, and how much of a challenge it is to work there. So I'm all about simplicity. So the challenge that we face very often, a big agency like RGA, and I imagine anyone who has any kind of clients, is that clients will come to you, whether it's an external client or someone internally, or if it's just yourself, you'll have some needs for a site that you're going to make. And they might, there could be all kinds of things, but typically you'd see a list that might include, they want a beautiful site, obviously. They want the content to be clear and well structured. They want good browser support. They want this site to be visible everywhere on the devices that they've got now, and the stuff that we don't know about yet. And they want it to load quickly. They want it to be fast into the browser, because we know that time and attention is frankly money. And then there's a bunch of other things as well that they might want. They might want the site to be very easy to update. Probably they're going to ask for a CMS because they want to own it and manage the content themselves later. And they want the content that's on there to be very dynamic and never go stale. And if they're a good client, they're going to want sensible URLs as well. And if they don't know about them, then it's kind of our job to teach them about it. And a lot of these, the list can go on, and one of the things that I often hear from a client is that they'll say, oh, what we need is a mobile-first responsive web app. And I don't actually know what that is. I don't know what one of those exactly looks like. There's some buzzwords being squeezed in there, but clients know these now. So they often really do come and say, oh, it's a mobile-first responsive web app. I think it's because they've seen that trending. There's a certain kind of buzz around this. But usually, not every time, but usually what they mean is that they'd really like you to build them a website and all of the things that entails. And so, it might be this big list of things, and some of those things are easier to achieve than others. And this kind of list over here, this is challenging. This is the kind of thing that is going to need some kind of infrastructure and plumbing, and we're going to need to wheel out the CG bit again. And so this talk really is me posing this question, is this stuff only possible with a dynamic server architecture? And that's the question I'm posing. And well, the clue, I guess, is the fact that I'm less than 10 minutes in, and either the answer is yes and I leave, or the answer I think is no. So I'm going to suggest that the answer is no. We'll kind of move on. So I'm interested in looking at ways that we can have a static architecture that yields dynamic features, that gives a site that can feel dynamic. And to understand how that works, then I suppose what we need to do is we need to figure out what dynamic means, because dynamic could mean a load of different things. It could mean personalized content that we're serving to you as an individual as you hit the site. We could talk about user-generated content, how we gather things from the user, or we could be talking about the time to refresh, and by that I mean the time to publish. How quickly can you update the content on the site? The kind of things that you get from like a CMS or some similar workflow. And keeping it fresh, keeping the site fresh is really important, and that's kind of where I want to focus on this particular talk. Now, there are reasons why simplifying the server architecture are really important, and I kind of want to go through a few of those before we then later go into some examples. But one of the things that I experienced quite a lot with working with various clients is this difference that infrastructure teams of the clients have in the way that they consider code deployments and content deployments, and they think of them very, very different. A code deployment they often think of as something that's going to run on their infrastructure, something that's going to be performing some logic in the back end, it's maybe going to be hitting the database, there's something going on there, it's not just dumb code. And then content they think of as all of the content on the site, the HTML, but also the CSS, often even the JavaScript, even though that's not really about content, that's typically more about behavior. But the key to separating this is that when they're considering the code that you're going to put into deployment rather than the content, they're going to go through all kinds of security audits with that, and there's lots of constraints that people often impose. So the simpler you can have that piece, and the more you can move into just having what they consider content, the easier that can be. So there's this kind of opportunity to actually get code deployed and out into production and out with the client much faster and with much less heartache, frankly. So really, in order to make an argument for this, we need to consider some use cases, and some really honest use cases, because there are all kinds of sites that we could be building, or applications, or what have you, and not everything's going to work for this. So this approach that I'm describing probably isn't best suited for things where there's targeted content, where each user has a profile and we serve something up specifically to them. Now, this is a JavaScript conference, and we could talk about how we could do that with JavaScript, but I'm a bit of a web hippie, and I kind of like to keep things static and then the content served in the HTML wherever possible. So, for the purposes of this talk, we'll consider just using things that are just the static site and not just loaded in with JavaScript. And so, we're talking really about sites that are probably read-only. There's not the same kind of interaction, but critically, they're read often. People will come back again and again. So really this is about how we can make that stuff faster, we can make it go faster, but also be updated faster. So I'm going to use this kind of groundbreaking approach, which was first mooted in 2002, so we're right on the bleeding edge. And it's this expression that was coined back in 2002, which is bake, don't fry. And this is a picture, I was trying to find something that expressed that, and this is confusing because we've got something here which is baked and fried. This is a butterscotch and bacon cupcake that I found on Flickr. It was termed mini Elvis cupcakes, which confused me because that's what mini Elvis looks like. But this couldn't matter less. We're talking about baking, not frying. And this term was coined by a guy called Aaron Swartz, and he wrote this blog, which thankfully you can still find because it still lives on the URL that is accessible. He wrote it in 2002. And Aaron was trying to challenge exactly the kind of things that we're seeing now, where lots of infrastructure is put in place to serve things up. Now, the sophistication levels were a bit different there, but he was still battling with the same kind of challenges. And he discovered this CMS at the time. It was a CMS that was written in Perl, and it essentially created a static site. It baked out a static site, which was then served. It wouldn't fry the content every time a user came and asked for it. Now, if you do the maths here, it's 2002, it's a CMS, it's written in Perl, it was called WebMake, so that's a snappy name. You can imagine it had a fantastic logo. Boom, there's the logo for WebMake from 2002. It needs a bit of a shine to it as well, I think, to give it its dues. But WebMake was tackling exactly this. It was about baking, not frying. And Aaron had this quote in his blog post. He said, "I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres, and Oracle installs." Well, it's 12 years ago this, but some of that rings true. I can completely relate to that, and my goal in reducing complexity is all about that. When we reduce complexity, then the ease of development increases, and so does the portability of what we're building. Being able to create something that we're not locked to an environment is a huge advantage. So just a quick kind of show of hands. Who in the room has now or has ever had a blog? Okay, so a good collection of people. Who out of those people has ever tried to redesign it or move it from one place to another and only got 70% of the way through? Okay, a few more people. Who has seen this page or something similar? These kind of WordPress error pages. I've seen them far too often. And let me be clear, I'm not bad-mouthing WordPress. It's a fantastic product. We use it very often on projects at RGA. We use it for very specific things, however. I think it's a great product, but it has an overhead. We need to maintain an infrastructure for that. And if you start your site 5 years ago, and then you decide, I'm going to move over to this great new environment, you need to make sure the dependencies are there. And it can get a little bit complex, even for something as simple as a WordPress site. And so this kind of touches on, this is a horrible expression, enterprise compliance. I kind of grimace using the expression, but I've worked on projects where WordPress wasn't allowed in the infrastructure because they see it as a threat. They see it as a security attack vector. And this comes back to how just all about the code deployment and the content deployment. Often when you're building something that's going to go out to the market, you have to deal with a security audit, and maybe there's penetration testing, load testing, and all of that stuff. And the more moving parts, the more machinery you have in the back end, the more rigorous and time-consuming these things can be. So if we can avoid it, it's a great way to try and do that. Now, Aaron, in his article, mentioned, he said, well, this is not about performance. For him, this is all about simplicity. But it's bearing in mind that there are some great performance gains to be made here as well. When you have a file-based architecture, which is essentially what you have when you just bake out a static site, then you end up with this really rapid request model where things are served up very quickly because they don't have to do any querying in the back end. Typically you put caching in front of this anyway, but even just a very big basic implementation, you're just serving stuff in files. And that's one of many reasons why the costs here can be low. And I'm going to step through a few things and we'll get on to some examples in a second. But there are lots of places where you can keep the costs down on the project through this kind of approach. Hosting is an obvious one if you only serving flat files. A colleague of mine saying he's just hosts a few personal sites and he had them on Azure, Microsoft Azure. And the reason for that is he had a nice virtualized environment and he was doing a few things in the back end. But frankly, they were static sites, and he didn't really need them to be on a virtualized environment. So he moved them to a static hosting platform that was free, and he's saving himself a bit of money every month. And that's not going to make a big deal on the kind of projects maybe we're talking about, but that's just for an individual. If you're talking about something which is an enterprise level or a web level, something on a global campaign level, then this stuff can be huge. This can make a really big difference. So that also has a knock-on for maintenance, of course. The way you maintain this environment is going to be much simpler if you've got less infrastructure in the first place, frankly fewer servers because you're not doing very much in the back end, you're just serving dump files, and less production code. It's really just that content code that's being served. So it's just another place that cost can come down. And then I mentioned portability already, but the fact that these files can go anywhere is really, it's really quite enabling. You can move from environment to environment, you're never locked into something, and that's something we certainly I'd welcome. Now another big advantage is just the availability of skills. This is a room full of people who have got front-end development skills. It's a JavaScript conference. So you don't always want to have all of the other skills that might go along with hosting a big dynamic site. So if we can kind of reduce the architectural complexity here, then the talent pool that we can recruit from, that we can use on a project, gets much bigger, and that's just great for everyone. And of course that means that the development costs come down as well, and confidence goes up. But I'm starting to sound like I'm preaching about this, and I guess I am, because I think there's so many benefits here. But trying to get back into the real world a little bit and think about how this has come about, it really comes down to what kind of tools and enablers there are that can make this a reality. So, I mentioned it's all about trying to make things dynamic, and I think the key here is that we can make things dynamic through making it much easier to iterate our sites and produce things faster. And there's some tools that have helped us along the way there. So I'm just going to pick up a few of them. So I'm going to talk about generators, automation, and then a little bit more about hosting. So let's kick off with talking about generators first of all. Many people will have come across Jekyll, which is a Ruby static site generator, but there's a bunch of others. Jekyll obviously was soon accompanied by Hyde, and then there's Middleman, which is another Ruby one, DocPad for JavaScript, Assemble for JavaScript, Heart for JavaScript. The list kind of goes on. In fact, there's a site called staticsitegenerators.net, which is a static site. It's hosted, it runs on DocPad, which is one of those JavaScript generators. It's automated, so it's very, very rapidly kept up to date. In fact, it's almost too readily kept up to date. There's currently 274 static site generator. It's a software that this knows about, which is quite a lot. In fact, when I was just looking over the slides this morning, I checked that. So that's 278. I imagine by the time this talk ends, someone else would have thought, I'm going to solve this problem as well, and they've written their own piece of software and it'll be 279. This just needs to be like a revolving counter. And this is that hipster tax in effect. Again, if you want to know the latest one, you've always got to be on top of it. But no, I really love Jekyll. I know this is a Ruby bit of software and this is a JavaScript conference, but nonetheless, I'm going to talk about it for a second. Because I think it's incredibly powerful. We use it on all kinds of projects, both personal and at work. But not everyone's a fan of this. I saw this tweet not so long ago from Memory Sharp saying, I suspect that this was one of the reasons I put on Jekyll, and he's getting gem issues, you can't really see it, but this is gem installed Jekyll, we should just magically install it and all its dependencies. He's got his Ruby environment screwed up. And I think lots of us have been there, and that kind of represents where we are on the spectrum. I started off talking about plumbing and infrastructure and things that live on the back end, and that's maybe like a larger stack. This is kind of a small stack where we've got rid of some of that. We're using a tool just at our build time, but it's still introducing another technology and another set of dependencies. We're building with Ruby here. It'd be nice to be able to just use HTML, JavaScript, CSS, the technologies as front-end developers we're familiar with. But Aaron Tools was saying that one of the issues here was that one of the problems with the bait philosophy is dependencies. It's difficult to keep track of which pages depend on which others and regenerate them correctly when they change. Well, I kind of argue that this is solved here because of things like the rich templating engines we have available to us now. Later on today, he's going to talk about other kind of build mechanics as well, which is probably going to take this a bit further and look at this from a different angle. But when it comes to rendering out a load of pages and knowing how they kind of interplay and what dependencies are between them, then we've got all kinds of templating mechanics now. They give us kind of partials and template inheritance, and there's logic that you can have right there in the templates. And that's enabled all kinds of things when it comes to static site generation. Templates are similar to static site generators in that there are a lot of them and they're always evolving. I was looking at the Wikipedia because that's where every speaker does their research for talk, obviously, on Wikipedia. And on the Wikipedia page, there's kind of a list of the templating technologies that are out there, and they just kind of go on and on and on. I mean, there's plenty that we'll recognise, from Closure to Mustache, which of course is really popular, implemented everywhere. But I've got to be careful about using Wikipedia to make a point, because further back up the page, there is a section on static page generators. So I was kind of cautious about what we're going to say there, especially when I noticed that they're kind of highlighting Dreamweaver, Flash, and Front Page as the kind of go-to references for that. It's not quite the direction I'll be going in today, I'm afraid. Since we mentioned dependencies, the dependencies between pages, and we saw that example of Remy Sharp, having difficulty with getting Jekyll running because of the dependencies he needed at the build, it's worth kind of invoking Atwood's law at this point. And it's a room full of JavaScript folks, so I imagine that many people have encountered Atwood's law before. Atwood's law states that any application that can be written in JavaScript eventually will be written in JavaScript. And he said this in 2007, and certainly we're seeing a lot of that coming true. We've already seen NPM, in Sebastian's talk earlier on, and a lot of people will have encountered this. rather than using Ruby and gems to manage our dependencies for Jekyll, maybe we can move to something which is pure JavaScript, the language that we know and we're using in the front end, and be managing our dependencies with something like npm install. Just a tiny little thing. Do many people realize that there's an alternative to install? You can also use isn't all, which is apparently such a common typo and frustrated enough people that Isaac said, okay, right, we'll put that in as well. So now I need typo compliance for everything I do, I'll be honest, but this is one little thing that makes life easier. So if we're using this, if we're using JavaScript in the build, JavaScript for the site generation and the templates, and in the front ends, then we're starting to move from the big stack down to the small stack with Ruby, and then further down to this kind of tiny stack where the number of technologies we need to know about is getting really reduced. So that kind of comes back to the argument I was making before about we need less types of people to work on this, less technologies at play rather. So I mentioned that maybe there's some JavaScript static site generators. This one's really popular. I'd encourage people to check it out if you're going to dabble in this. Hawksworth. This has all of the kind of things that you might expect in it. It handles lots of pre-processing and it manages your templates for you, either using EJS or Swing. I think we can extend it to use any templating language. It also will kind of do all the pre-processing of your SAS, or you can use less if you prefer. And if you're a CoffeeScript guy, are there any CoffeeScript people here? There's a few hands. I think I even heard a whoop from the back. So if CoffeeScript is your thing, then this takes care of that really seamlessly for you as well. And it's very like Jekyll, but it's a little less blog-centric, which might mean that it's a bit more flexible for the kind of things that you might want to do with it once we go beyond just building a blog. And it really is all about encapsulating data objects that you can then use around your site and using your templating layer. So, this is all kind of still improving, but this is kind of demonstrating the rapid and powerful site generation, the kind of things that Aaron Swartz was kind of craving for back in 2002. This is almost kind of solved. I think we've just about called it solved for many cases. Okay, so let's move on to automation. Talk a little bit about generators themselves. Automation is an important area as well. Now, my first day at a previous agency, in a slightly former life, I entered the office and someone said to me, "Oh, thank goodness you're starting today because we really need some help deploying this site." I'd been in the building 10 minutes, so that was terrifying. And it was more terrifying when I saw how we were deploying sites to production. We were working, this was the new we, I'd been there 10 minutes. We were working on this project for a healthcare provider in the UK, and they had a site that we'd been, we built before, and this was the next iteration of it, and it had a pretty large audience. So I had slightly sweaty palms when I saw how we were deploying it and I was struggling, because what would happen would be the developer would sit in front of his computer and he would look at all of the files that he had for the website. Then he would open up an FTP window and look at all of the files on the server. And then he would drag and drop, a bunch of the files at a time. And then he'd go and hit refresh, and he'd go, no. And then he'd get another one, and he'd go across. And I kind of watched this as the blood drained from my face. And this is a perfect way to shoot yourself in the face. And I know that this still happens. People still deploy things this way. But thankfully, there's a better way now. Automation has come to the rescue. And I'd urge everyone to kind of move towards automating this kind of process wherever they possibly can to avoid that gun. But when you're automating this stuff, then it means that inherently it's repeatable and the process is predictable. And actually deploying is really low friction. Deploying can be as simple as running a command and then resting assured that you've done the hard work ahead of time. And there are lots of deployment automation tools around. I really like Fabric, which is actually, again, introducing other technologies at a JavaScript conference. This is a Python framework. And I use this a lot when we were building things with Django, which is obviously also built in Python. But Fabric is just a tool for doing local and authenticated remote tasks. That's all it does. but thankfully Atwood's law is at work again, because now we've got things like grunt, we've got gulp, there's also a JavaScript automation script called brunch, and it's only a matter of time before we've got belch, burp, cough, sneeze is going to be big, I'm predicting. This is all in that hipster zone again, so kind of, this is probably one of the things that's been added to that list of things we've already got. So automation kind of is there, these tools exist, and there are much better tools that look at build automation using things like grunt and gulp. So I'm not going to dig into those here. Instead, I'm just going to kind of rattle straight along to hosting, because I want to get to the point that we can look at a couple of examples. Hosting static sites is just incredibly simple now. It's really, really simple. And there's a bunch of things that I'd call out as places to look for providing static site hosting. I really like this one, Site44, because it's built on top of Dropbox. You can just enable a folder in your Dropbox, which effectively is that htdocs route, and then they resolve a site, a URL to that for you. You need to be a little bit careful, because if you're not cautious, you could find yourself back in this kind of world of your deployment. But for lots of simple sites, this is actually really, really simple. It's a fast way to get something statically served. And of course, you can automate this process of pushing something from your builds folder into your local Dropbox folder, and then it propagates out to the web kind of seamlessly. Most people, I'm sure, will be familiar with GitHub Pages, which is just such a great enabling product. Of course, they serve static files for you, and they do it for free. And it's very, very simple to automate the deployment to that. In fact, you need to do it via a Git push. So this is obviously a great tool. But there are also other things around there. There's all kinds of levels of sophistication, but this one I kind of like. It's something called BitBalloon. Again, it's a static site hosting service. And on their site, they invite you to drop a folder of assets on there, and they'll upload it and serve it all for you, and then you can associate a domain with it. But they do all kinds of other bits and pieces as well. They actually do a lot of optimizing of your assets. So they'll do all of the compression, they'll do all kinds of optimization on the assets that you put up there, and then they'll propagate them to CDNs, and they manage the CDNs for you. So you can actually do some fairly sophisticated stuff by not having to do anything at all. And you can also, rather than just dragging and dropping it onto their website, of course you can automate this as well. And they have an API, and they've got a bunch of other funky shit to layer on top of that. And we'll come back to some of that in a second as part of an example. But ultimately, it just means that you can just push your code and it gets out there into the world. So finally, we've got some examples. I'm going to start with a really simple example, but a very important example. And that's the site at RGA we have for our beer club, where everybody tastes the beer. And I've chosen this because it's a very simple example. It's a simple one-page site, and it's just a linear page. It has an incredibly simple workflow to produce it, but it's also powered by nerds. It's something that's really predominantly in the development team at RGA. But let's look at what that workflow is, considering who the people are that are using it. And this thing has outsourced hosting in so much as it's on GitHub Pages, so no infrastructure for us to maintain there. Thank you very much. We deploy it using Git push origin GitHub Pages. Sorry if that's hard to read. I'll read out as many of the commands as I can. And of course, through this, we're using Git, so of course that means we've got version control. Someone's hosting that for us. That's all taken care of. And in fact, as we'll see in a second, the actual site generation of this is automated as well, along with the deployment. Because even though it's using GitHub Pages, we don't need to pull the site down, pull the repository down, clone it, make the changes, and then commit those back. We can actually do it entirely on GitHub, as we'll see in a second. One of the things, so this is a Jekyll site, and one of the things that's really nice here is that Jekyll's starting to expose more data. So it used to be very, very block-centric, but now they're actually exposing a data folder where you can put whatever files you like in there. They're just YAML files, and as long as you put YAML files in there, it means you can get at that data in a structured way for using your templates and in the site. So it actually makes this really quite powerful. So our page is just a load of beers that we've tasted, and so all of those drops of beer that we've tried, are in a file called drops.YAML that we have in our data directory, but it means we can iterate over them using site.data.drops and then query inspect that object and then populate the template accordingly. And so, I mentioned it's incredibly simple, and yeah, as you can see, it is. It's just a linear thing, but it's just the first example. But at the bottom we have just a link. Again, this is powered by nerds, so at the bottom we have a link back to the GitHub repository, and this takes us directly to our YAML file. So here we are. It's in the data directory, and we've got drops.YAML, and of course you can edit things live on GitHub. In this view, so all we do whenever we add a new entry here is we just add another blob of YAML at the top of that. And since Jekyll was started as part of GitHub, GitHub will then parse that site. They'll regenerate the site. They'll build it for us. They have all the build mechanics right there on the site, and that will then spawn the new site for us. So this is the kind of thing that we edit and deploy on our phone as we're walking back to our desk after having a bit of beer. So it's fairly lightweight. Now I mentioned that this is powered by nerds, so maybe not everyone wants to do this, but I think actually it was born to be useful for everyone. One of the partners of one of the guys on the development team saw this and said, "Oh, we have a Cape Club at our office. We need the same thing." So they forked the site, they changed the skid, they changed the cycle. There are a few similarities still, but this is again the simplest example. It's using that simplest workflow, but critically this time it's not powered by nerds. And the point I'm trying to make here is that people who were not developers were quite happy to go and manage content in GitHub when it was so structured and so simple. So now they've got all of the same power of the static site being generated, deployed, hosted, cost them nothing, and it's very simple. And it's kind of an interesting way to see how well that could get around. Now, this is obviously a very simple demonstration, but simplifying doesn't necessarily mean that we're dumbing down. I like to think that actually it means that we're just focusing on the stuff that matters. An example of somewhere that we did this more recently at RGA, using Jekyll and using a static site approach, is with a project we did with Google, and it was for the Chrome developer relations team. It went live just recently, and it's still kind of evolving. But there's a site that the Chrome team put together, the DevRel team rather put together, which is Web Fundamentals, which is meant to be talking about responsive web design and ways we can build things on the web. And it's a load of articles and techniques and really content to try and help people understand some of these techniques. But it's built using Jekyll. It's a static site. And that's the only way that we could have ever really done this in the time. This whole thing was built in about 4 weeks, including the design phase and everything. And one of the things that's really tough here is, I mentioned client infrastructure. Getting a site built and then hosted on a google.com domain is not straightforward. Obviously, they've got a lot of restrictions on the kind of code you could put into their infrastructure, and rightly so. So the fact that this was a static site meant that it was a breeze to get it in there. It was very simple to go through the audit process of that and get it published quickly. The whole thing is out in the open. It's on Google's GitHub repository. And the thing that was beautiful about this project, I thought, was it was very simple. It was highly simplified using Jekyll, but there's actually a load of content. But that simplification meant that we could focus on what matters, and it meant that the authors, a lot of the DevRel team, could be authoring that content right in the site, right in the environment, and getting things happening really, really fast without having to worry about what does the CMS work like, how does that work, what's the infrastructure. Naturally, with this kind of approach, there's a bunch of limitations and a few workarounds we need to make. We're talking about very simple static sites here, even if they are published very, very frequently and have a lot of content. And two that kind of stand out are search and comments. I just want to pick up on those with a couple of examples. So search, again, is something actually we can solve. Let me show you, again, it's a Jekyll example, but of course, any static site generator could work for this. Search is an area where there can be all kinds of complexity. Search is a fairly complex thing to do, but often the kind of sites that we're building, actually you could have a fairly simple search solution. So this is a search example that has a simple index. It's using JavaScript to make that execute, but it does take a progressive enhancement approach. I mentioned earlier I'm a bit of a web hippie, so I'm kind of keen to make sure that we're building things that work in as many contexts as possible. So it's a very simple site, and I'll just show you an example of it on my blog, which is just a blog like any other. So this is generated with Jekyll, and one of the things that you just get in the base Jekyll install when you just init a new site and it gives you a boilerplate, is it kind of demonstrates how to produce the sitemap XML, and it does that using something like this. I hope people can see that. It's maybe a touch difficult, but ultimately what this is just a file that will iterate all of the posts and any of the, in this case just the posts, that's what I'm interested in, but all of the content of the site, and loop over all of those files, which are the blog post files, and then pull out some data from the structured data that's in them. And this is going to create a search.json, so this is the source for search.json. But all we're doing is we're populating a big blob of JSON that describes the content of the site. So for each post, we end up with something which has, actually I'm going to go back for a second. So we have an object which contains the title, the URL, the date, and then a long list of words that are included in the content of that post. Now we do a couple of little things here to try and make this a bit more efficient. So we look at the content of the post, and we actually strip out all of the HTML, because we're not going to want to index over the HTML elements, we just want the text. So we strip that out, and that just leaves us with the words. And then, again, sorry, it's hard to see, but then we push that content to another function, which is just a little bit of Jekyll function called word map. And what that does is it takes out every duplication, all of it just totally dedupes the string of content, and then it also looks for words that might not be helpful in a search request. In, on, of, I, short words that maybe aren't going to be quite so meaningful. And so the aim of that is just to squash down the length of this string. And so then it spits out something that looks a little bit like this, if you can see it, but it's exactly what you might expect. It's the title, the URL, the date, and then a chunk of words. And then what we do is we use that and we just search based on what we type in over that blob of words, and it resolves to an entry. And it means that with JavaScript we can very quickly populate this list of search results. Now, this isn't doing a round trip to the server, it's all happening in the client, so it feels incredibly snappy and incredibly fast. And it works pretty well. It's not the most sophisticated search in the world, but on a site like this, and lots of sites where you just need simple search, this actually works like a charm. People are going to be thinking, well, hang on, you're adding the content of your entire site as a blob of JSON to every single page. That sounds insane. Well, yes, it would be, but we can get around that fairly simply. First of all, this is loaded asynchronously after the page. We don't need that at the start. So this is actually loaded right at the end after the page is rendered and the user is already using the site. Also, this thing is heavily cached and static. It's going to get gzipped, it's going to be cached, and it only changes as often as you post content to the site. So once the user has this once, then it's just going to be there for them. But also, you can load this contextually as well. You don't need this for everyone. You only need it if someone's actually going to go and try searching. So the example of that, we just look at the web inspector for a second, and we go off and we search. So just refresh the page, and then you'll see it's not very many assets for the site. Just the HTML, the CSS, a couple of images. There's a font loaded in, and then there's some Google Analytics. And then we actually hit search. At that point, we show the interface, and while the interface is rendered, which obviously just takes a second, then we load in the JavaScript behind the scenes. And so by the time the user sees where the search bar pops up, then they're ready to start typing, and the content is there ready to go. So we're not actually adding too much of a burden to the site, and of course once we have this, then it's cached. Now, I promised earlier on that this is the progressive enhancement approach, and it doesn't really look like that at the moment. It's all heavy JavaScript. And so actually the way we get around that is also really simple. The page here, the search interface. Yeah, so if we turn off JavaScript, we can take a look at this. Because all we're doing, of course, is when we click on search, at the moment we're using JavaScript to render that little search box in there. But without JavaScript, all that's going to do is just act like a regular link. It's going to take you to the search page. And the search page has a search form on it, which is powered by Google. So all we're going to do in that case is, a user can go off to that, and then they can type in their search. It will take them off to Google. They can and then they can find the result and come back. And then the search here has just been focused just for this site, very simply by adding a site parameter in. So again, let me try and read that for you for the one that is critical. It's just a standard search form, as you might expect, but there's two input values that we're sending through, and they're both called Q. So the text input that you can see that you search into has the name Q, that's the parameter that Google expects. We also hide another search input field also with the name Q, and there we put in the fact that it's the site parameter, and we can focus even it down to the blog, and that just makes that work perfectly for us. Remy Sharp's just started using exactly this approach on his JSBin help site for his JSBin project. He's using Harp for this, but he uses exactly the same technique, although he does it a bit nicer than me, and he's got some kind of keyboard shortcuts and what have you. I'm perilously close to being out of time, but I just want to mention comments kind of quickly, because comments, as we all know, are kind of a very valuable, useful part of the web. Staggering around for my slides, sorry. Comments is obviously something where we're going to be gathering user-generated content and including it in the site. How can we really do that on a statically generated site? Of course, the answer is you cheat. You have to look at what's the workflow for comments. Should comments automatically appear when someone posts them, or should they be kind of moderated? Is there some kind of workflow for that? And if you can live with an approval process for comments, and lots of places have this anyway, and lots of companies enforce this, then we can get around this constraint. Lots of places you just say, okay, well, I'll put discuss. I'll embed discuss on my site, and that will give me comments out of the box, which of course will work fine. But it's a JavaScript dependency, and as I mentioned, I'm keen about seeing how can we get this content into the site itself. So briefly, BitBalloon, we mentioned it earlier on, and I said there was some extra funky shizzle there. And BitBalloon have some APIs that you can use. They actually do all kinds of handy things for you. And one of the things they enable is they actually automatically handle any forms that you include on your static site. So any form that is just going to post to nowhere, in fact what you tend to do is you give it, the action is just the kind of thank you page that you want to direct it to. But any data that's posted back to the site that you're hosting with them, they'll capture that content for you and they'll make it available later on. So I guess this does have a database, but we don't have to ever touch it. It's given to you for free by this kind of static hosting environment. So there, they'll do the data handling, and they give you an API endpoint, and even do things like email notifications when someone posts something to it. And you can integrate with all kinds of different services, and it can be the trigger for all kinds of other things. But ultimately, it means that you have a data endpoint that you can query that's going to have those comments in it. And since we've already talked about making build automation super simple and deployment super simple and have no friction, it actually means that we can get the data as part of the build. So someone posts a comment to your site, the administrator of that gets a notification, and they run a build, and that just pulls the content in from the API, it embeds it in the site statically, and then it publishes it off to the hosting, and you have your comment right there as part of the page. So we're timed it over time. I know it's lunchtime, so we should wrap this up, and everyone should get something to eat. But one of the things that I want to just kind of finish off with is this slight call to arms that we've got a great opportunity now to simplify things and actually do things a lot more effectively and efficiently than maybe we have in the past. So I suggest we should look for those opportunities and challenge the need for complexity, because it can creep in everywhere. And if we do that, it means that we can maybe make stuff faster, and it means that we can make stuff go faster as well. So that's it from me. There's a bunch of links that are in the slides for this, and my thanks for people whose photos I've pilfered from Flickr. The slides will be online later on today, and I'll tweet out a link to it so you can grab this. That's my lot. Thank you very much.